Jacob Wilson, a man whose skin seemed parched by the sun and weathered by the winds of the plains, walked along the dusty road that led to his farm. His broad shoulders, accustomed to the weight of a sack of grain or a plowshare, slouched slightly under the weight of an old leather knapsack. Tall, with sinewy arms and calloused palms, he looked as if he had been hewn from the same earth he had tilled all his life. His face, with its sharp features and deep wrinkles, seemed like a map of his labors. Each line told of drought, crop failure, or, on the contrary, a bountiful summer. But his eyes, bright blue, like pieces of sky that had fallen on this parched earth, betrayed in him not only a farmer, but also a dreamer. Jacob rarely spoke of his dreams, but they lived inside him, hidden behind a stern appearance and taciturnity. His steps were measured, but there was a hint of weariness in them. The grain fair in the neighboring town, where he went once a season, had been shorter than he had expected. A storm warning announced on the local radio had forced the merchants to take down their tents a day early. Jacob, a practical man, did not argue with nature. He knew that a storm on the plains was no joke. The wind here could uproot trees, and the rain could turn the fields into impassable swamps. Better to return home to his family than to be stuck in a town where the only hotel smelled of dampness and cheap tobacco. The sky above was heavy as lead. The clouds, low and thick, seemed to have conspired to block out the last rays of the sun. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the coming of a thunderstorm. Jacob adjusted his hat, old and battered, but faithful as an old dog, and quickened his pace. He thought of his farm, of the house he had built with his own hands 20 years ago, of his wife, Emma, and their daughter, Sarah. The thought of them warmed him like a warm fireplace on a winter night. He imagined himself entering the house, Emma, with her soft smile and warm arms, meeting him at the threshold, and Sarah, almost grown, but still his little girl, throwing herself into his arms, forgetting her teenage reserve. Jacob was a man of tradition. Every morning he would rise before dawn, brew strong coffee in an old copper pot that had been handed down to him by his father, and go out to check on the fields. This ritual was as sacred to him as a prayer. He believed that the land responded to those who respected it, and he never allowed himself to be lazy. Even in the hardest years, when drought or locusts destroyed the crops, he did not lose faith. "The land always returns the favor," he said, and there was more than just hope in his voice, but conviction. Emma often made fun of his stubbornness, calling him a man who argues with the wind, but deep down she admired his fortitude. Emma was Jacob's opposite, soft where he was hard, talkative where he was silent. Her hair, once golden as ripe wheat, was now touched with gray, but her eyes, dark brown, with a sparkle of laughter, were as lively as on their wedding day. She was the heart of their home. Emma knew how to turn even the most modest dinner into a celebration. There were always fresh flowers on the table, even if they were just dandelions from the roadside, and her cooking, be it apple pie or baked beans, made everyone forget about their worries. She loved to tell stories, and her voice, melodious and warm, could calm even the storm in Jacob's soul. But behind her softness there was a will of steel. When a hurricane hit the farm last year, it was Emma who organized neighbors to rebuild the barn while Jacob was in town trying to negotiate a new loan. Sarah, their 16-year-old daughter, was a mixture of both. Stubborn like her father, with a hint of her mother's charm. Her dark braided hair and freckled face made her look like a girl from the neighboring farm, but there was already an adult wistfulness in her eyes. Sarah dreamed of the big world of cities without dusty roads, of the books she read in the school library, of a life without having to get up at 4 in the morning to milk cows. Jacob saw it in her, and sometimes it worried him. He loved his daughter, but he was afraid that one day her dreams would take her far from the farm, from the land that was everything to him. The road wound through fields of corn, tall and thick as a green sea. Jacob paused to catch his breath and looked up at the sky. The clouds were darker still, and somewhere in the distance he heard the first rumble of thunder. He felt a stirring of worry in his chest. Not for himself, he was used to the vagaries of the weather, but for Emma and Sarah. He imagined them sitting at home, perhaps by the fire, listening to the radio, which was probably crackling with static by now. I should call them home, he thought, but then stopped himself. The farmhouse phone was old, with a crack in the receiver, and it often lost service before a storm. Better hurry. When he finally saw the familiar silhouette of the house squat, with a wooden porch and peeling white paint, his heart sank for a moment. The lights were on in the windows, and a thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and comfort. But something was wrong. Jacob frowned. On the porch stood a pair of unfamiliar boots covered in fresh mud. His gaze slid to the barn. The door was ajar, although he clearly remembered closing it before leaving. He slowed his pace, listening. Snatches of voices came from the house on the wind low, male, not belonging to any of the neighbors. "Emma," he called, approaching the porch. His voice, usually firm, wavered with a vague premonition. The door swung open and Emma appeared on the threshold. Her face, usually calm, was tense, and her smile seemed forced. Jacob ascending to the door, it swung open, and Jacob appeared on the threshold. Emma, trying to hide her excitement, smiled wider. "Jacob, you're back early." She stepped toward him, hugging him, but her movements were abrupt, as if she was in a hurry to distract him from something. "The storm drove me home," he said, holding her close. The scent of her hair, a mix of lavender and homemade soap, was so familiar that he closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the moment. But then he pulled back, looking into her eyes. "Is something wrong? Whose boots are these?" Emma hesitated, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of her apron. "It's just a guest," she said, but her voice wavered. "Come in, I'll make you dinner." "A guest?" Jacob frowned, his gaze darting to his boots again. "Who?" Footsteps came from the kitchen, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was tall and thin, with sharp cheekbones and wary eyes. He wore a shabby jacket and held a mug of steaming tea. Jacob felt something sharp prick his chest, like a mixture of anger and fear. "It's Nathan," Emma said quickly, her voice too high. He was passing by, asked if he could wait out the storm. Nathan stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Nathan Crow," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of steel in it. "Pleased to meet you. Emma's told me a lot about you." Jacob shook his hand, but his grip was tighter than necessary. He didn't like strangers in his house, especially those who showed up unannounced, and especially those whose boots stood on his porch like they owned the place. "You told me, huh?" Jacob narrowed his eyes on Emma. "And how long has he been here?" "This morning," she said, looking away. "He helped with the cows when I was in the field. Sarah found him on the road, looking lost." "Lost," Jacob repeated, and there was ice in his voice. He turned to Nathan. "And where are you going, Nathan Crow?" The man held his gaze without looking away. "North," he said. "Looking for work. Thought maybe you'd have something. But if I'm in the way, I can leave right now." "There's a storm coming," Emma interjected, her voice firmer. "You can't turn a man out in weather like this, Jacob. He'll be staying until morning." Jacob was silent, his jaw tense. He didn't like it when decisions were made in his house without him. But Emma was right, sending a man out into the storm was inhuman. He nodded, but his gaze remained cold. "Okay, but you'll be leaving in the morning," he told Nathan. "And take your boots off the veranda." Nathan nodded, his face unreadable. "Got it. Thank you for your hospitality." Sarah emerged from her room, her eyes bright with curiosity. She was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, but her movements were graceful, like her mother's. She looked lax at her father, then at Nathan, and smiled. "Dad, you're home." She rushed to him, hugging him so tightly that he couldn't help but smile. "I missed you so much." "Me too, baby," he said, holding her close. But his mind was elsewhere. He looked at Nathan over his daughter's head, and a feeling grew in his chest that this man had brought with him not only dirty boots, but something far more dangerous. Dinner passed in tense silence. Emma set a bowl of baked beans and fresh bread from the morning on the table. Jacob ate slowly, watching Nathan. He was polite, said little, but his movements were precise, like a man who was used to keeping himself in check. Sarah, on the other hand, chatted incessantly, talking about school, about the new literature teacher who reads Shakespeare with such passion that even she, who hated poetry, began to listen to it. Jacob listened to her with half an ear, his mind occupied with other things. After dinner, Nathan volunteered to help with the dishes, but Jacob snapped. "We can handle it ourselves. You're a guest." Nathan nodded and walked into the guest room Emma had prepared for him. As he disappeared through the door, Jacob turned to his wife. "What is he doing here, Emma?" he asked quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Emma sighed, drying her hands with a towel. "He's just a traveler, Jacob. He asked for help. I couldn't refuse." "You've always been too kind," he said, but there was no warmth in his tone. "But I don't trust him." "You don't trust anyone," she replied, trying to smile, but it came out tired. "Give him a chance. He doesn't look dangerous." "Just because it looks doesn't mean it's safe," Jacob snapped. He stood up, his chair scraping on the wooden floor. "I'll check the shed. Something tells me there's something wrong there." Emma wanted to say something, but she kept silent. She knew there was no point in arguing with Jacob when he was in this mood. He put on his hat and went out into the night, where the wind was already howling, promising a storm. The barn door was still ajar, and inside, in the dim light of the lantern, he saw marks that shouldn't be there. Someone had been rummaging through his tools, and it wasn't him. Jacob returned to the house, his face dark as a storm. He hadn't told Emma what he'd found, but he had decided that he would talk to Nathan in the morning, and it wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. The morning greeted Jacob with the heavy smell of damp earth and the distant rumble of thunder that never quite broke into a full-blown storm. The sky remained gray, but the rain the meteorologists had promised lingered, as if giving the world a break. Jacob woke earlier than usual, before the first rays of light had broken through the thick clouds. His habit of rising with the first roosters was stronger than the fatigue accumulated from the days of the fair and the long walk home. He lay in bed, staring at the familiar cracks in the wooden ceiling, and tried to drive away thoughts of Nathan Crow, whose dirty boots and too calm gaze haunted him. Emma slept beside him, her breathing even, almost inaudible. Her face, even in sleep, retained a softness that always soothed him. But last night had left a sour taste in his mouth, not because of the words, but because of what had been left unsaid. Nathan had left at dawn, as he had promised, leaving behind only a light trail of dirt on the porch and a vague sense of unease in Jacob's chest. He had not woken Emma to ask about the stranger. Instead, he had quietly risen, brewed his morning coffee in the old copper pot, and stepped out onto the porch to consider the day. The farm needed attention. The cattle feed was running low, and the barn needed some rotten boards replaced. Jacob decided that a trip to town to do some shopping was urgent. There was a small hardware store in the town about 30 miles away where he usually bought everything he needed, from nails to sacks of oats. Emma had also asked for flour and some fabric to make Sarah a new dress for the school dance. Jacob didn't like the city, its noise and bustle, but he was willing to endure even that for his family. "Sarah," he called, returning to the house. His daughter, already dressed in her school uniform, was sitting at the kitchen table, leafing through a literature textbook. Her dark hair was neatly braided, but there was that same sincere restlessness in her eyes that reminded Jacob of himself in his youth. "What, Dad?" She raised her head, putting the book down. "Are you going to town already?" "Yes," he nodded, pouring coffee into an old tin mug. "Want something from there? A book, or maybe some candy?" Sarah smiled, her freckles dancing across her cheeks. "A book, of course. Something about adventures, or about the sea. I read about pirates last week, and now I can't stop thinking about ships and storms." "Pirates, huh?" Jacob chuckled, but there was warmth in his voice. "I'll see what I can find. And you behave well at school, okay?" "Dad, I always behave well," she replied with feigned resentment, but her eyes were laughing. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hair slightly disheveled and her apron already tied over her plain blue dress. She looked at Jacob, a trace of the tension from the night before flickering in her eyes. "Are you staying in town for long?" she asked, putting a frying pan on the stove. I was thinking we could all have dinner together tonight. I'll be back by evening, he replied, finishing his coffee, if the storm doesn't start before I get home. Emma nodded, but her smile was a little forced. Jacob noticed, but said nothing. He kissed her forehead, patted Sarah's hair, and walked out to the old pickup parked by the barn. The truck, which had seen better days, started up on the third try, and Jacob took one last look back at the house before setting off. The road into town was familiar, down to the potholes. The fields around it were sometimes green with corn, sometimes golden with wheat, and in the distance he could see the silhouettes of rolling hills covered with scattered trees. Jacob turned on the radio, but instead of music he heard only static and snatches of a weather report. He turned it off and concentrated on the road, letting his thoughts flow. He thought about Nathan, about the strange way he held himself, about the way Emma avoided his gaze when she spoke of the guest. Something about this story didn't add up, but Jacob couldn't put his finger on it. He decided that he would talk to Emma that evening, when they were alone, directly, without beating around the bush, the way he was used to solving all problems. The town greeted him with its usual hubbub. The streets were narrow, the houses low, with peeling paint and signs that creaked in the wind. Jacob parked outside a hardware store where every clerk knew him. Old Joe, the owner, greeted him with a big smile. "Jacob Wilson," he cried, wiping his hands on his apron. "I didn't expect you so soon after the fair. Did the storm drive you away?" "Something like that," Jacob replied, shaking his hand. "Nails, boards, a couple of sacks of oats, and flour for Emma. Oh, and clothes, if you've got anything decent." "A dress for Sarah?" Joe winked. "Does Emma still make her dresses like the old days?" "Yeah," Jacob nodded, the corners of his lips twitching into a smile. "Tradition, you know." While Joe was putting together his order, Jacob walked around the store, looking at the shelves. His gaze fell on a small display case of books. Among the tattered volumes, he noticed one with a bright cover, Treasure Island. He picked it up, leafing through the yellowed pages. Sarah would be thrilled. He added the book to his shopping list, and after paying, headed for the truck. But there was one more thing to do in town. Jacob decided to stop by the local bar, where farmers sometimes gathered to exchange news. He was not a big drinker, but a few words with the neighbors might shed some light on Nathan Crow. Maybe someone had seen him or knew him. The bar was almost empty, except for a few regulars at the bar. Jacob ordered a glass of water and approached old Walter, whose farm was 10 miles from his own. "Walter," he began, sitting down next to her, "did you see any stranger on the road yesterday? Tall, thin, in a shabby jacket." Walter thought, scratching his gray beard. "I don't remember," he finally answered. "But you know, there are a lot of vagabonds hanging around these days. Looking for work, they say. And what are you asking? Problems?" "Not yet," Jacob muttered. "Just curious." He didn't go into detail. Walter was a good man, but he liked to gossip, and Jacob didn't want his family talked about. He finished his water, said goodbye, and went back to the truck. The groceries were in the back, and he glanced at the darkening sky and decided not to linger. The drive back was longer than he'd liked. The wind was picking up, raising dust from the roadside, and Jacob felt the tension in his chest growing. He thought about home, about Emma, about Sarah, about how everything in his life had been simple and clear before this Nathan had come along. He pushed away the thought that Emma might be hiding something, but doubt was already lodged in his heart like a splinter. By the time he pulled up to the farm, the sun had already set, and the first drops of rain were hitting the windshield. The house looked the same as always, with warm light pouring in from the windows and smoke curling out of the chimney. But something was wrong. Jacob noticed that the barn door was ajar again, although he had definitely closed it that morning. He frowned, but decided to go inside first. Shopping could wait. He walked in quietly, shaking the rain off his hat. The house was warm, smelling of fresh bread and something sweet. Emma was probably baking a pie. But the silence in the living room was unusual. Usually Sarah would have the radio on or would chatter away, but now he could only hear muffled voices coming from the bedroom, and laughter. Light, almost playful. Female, Emma's. Jacob froze. His heart began to pound, but he forced himself to move slowly, silently. The bedroom door was ajar, and through the crack he saw a sight that made his blood run cold. Emma was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair loose and her smile the likes of which he hadn't seen in a long time. Opposite her, too close, stood Ethan, the young neighbor whose farm was 2 miles away. Ethan was tall, with a boyish face and a slight grin that Jacob always thought was too self-assured. He was talking, his hand resting on the headboard, almost touching Emma's shoulder. And she was laughing, her eyes shining, like in the days when she and Jacob were young and just starting out in their life together. Jacob didn't make a sound. He stood rooted to the spot, taking in every detail. The way Emma brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, the way Ethan leaned in a little closer, the way their voices mingled in a quiet, almost intimate conversation. He didn't know how long he stood there, a minute, too, but every second was etched in his memory like a knife. He didn't burst into the room, didn't shout, didn't make a scene. Instead, he turned and walked quietly out onto the porch, where the rain was already pouring down. He sat down on the old wooden bench, ignoring the cold streams running down his face. Questions swirled in his head that he didn't want to know the answers to. Why was Ethan here? Why was Emma laughing like she hadn't laughed with him in years? And what the hell was going on in his house while he was away on business? Jacob clenched his fists, feeling the anger and pain warring inside him. But he wasn't a man to act rashly. He would wait, watch, and if necessary, find out the truth, even if it broke his heart. Rain pounded the roof of the barn like invisible fingers drumming for attention. Jacob stood at the door, silhouetted against the dim light that poured in from the house. His hat, soaked with water, hung low over his eyes, hiding their expression. But if one could have looked into his face, they would have seen that his blue eyes, usually as clear as a summer sky, were now darkened as if before a storm. His chest heaved, but not from fatigue. There was a fire burning inside him that he was struggling to contain. He didn't go back into the house. He couldn't. The image he'd seen through the half-open bedroom door was still seared into his retinas. Emma, laughing, her hair loose, and Ethan, too close, too sure. Their voices, entwined in a light, almost intimate conversation, echoed in his head, impossible to silence. Jacob clenched his fists, feeling his nails digging into his palms. He didn't shout, didn't storm into the room, didn't make a scene, as perhaps someone else would have done. No, he wasn't one to throw words or emotions around. His anger was quiet, like the calm before a hurricane, but no less destructive. The barn became his sanctuary. Here, amid the smells of hay and old wood and machine oil, he could breathe without fear of being seen to be weak. He walked to the workbench in the corner where his tools lay: a hammer, chisels, an old plane he had used as a youth to help his father. These things were his anchors, reminders of who he was. Jacob Wilson, farmer, man of the land, man of action. He was not a man to wallow in words or to lose himself in doubt. He was a problem solver. And now, standing in the dim light of the barn, he made a decision. No tears, no shouting, just action. He took off his wet jacket, hanging it on a nail by the door, and went to the old wooden box where he kept his notes. It was his ritual to keep track of everything that concerned the farm. The harvest, the expenses, the debts, the plans for the next season. But today he did not open the notebook. Instead, he took out the small pocket knife he always carried in his pocket and began carving into a piece of soft wood lying on the workbench. His movements were slow, precise, almost meditative. Each cut, each shaving that fell to the floor, helped him gather his thoughts. He did not know what he was carving, maybe just lines, maybe the outline of something that had not yet taken shape. But it helped him not to think about what he was seeing, not to think about what it might mean. Jacob was a man who believed in honesty, not the kind you read about in books or preached about, but the simple, down-to-earth honesty he saw in every ear of wheat and every day spent in the fields. Emma had always been his rock, his light on days when the world seemed too heavy. They had married young, barely children, and together they had been through everything: droughts, crop failures, sickness, debt. He had never doubted her, not once. Even when the neighbors whispered that Emma was too beautiful for the farm life, that she should shine in a big city, he had brushed it aside. Emma had chosen him. Emma had chosen this life. But now, for the first time in 20 years, he felt something new stirring in his soul. Doubt, and it was more bitter than anything he had ever known. He paused, looking at the piece of wood in his hands. The mindless movements of the knife had transformed it into a crude simulacrum of a bird, a hawk perhaps, a raven perhaps. Jacob grinned, but there was no joy in his grin. Birds fly away, he thought. Birds are not tied to the earth. Maybe that was his mistake, to think that Emma, like him, was forever tied to this farm, to this life. The barn door creaked open, and Jacob turned. Sarah stood there, silhouetted by the dim light of the lantern hanging over the porch. Her hair was damp from the rain, and her face was serious, almost adult. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, stepping inside. Her voice was soft, but there was concern in it. "Mom's worried. You haven't come into the house. You haven't even eaten." Jacob put down the knife and piece of wood, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just checking to make sure everything was okay," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "The rain can do a lot of damage, you know." Sarah looked at him, her brows furrowing slightly. She was too smart to believe that excuse. But she didn't argue, just walked closer and sat down on the old box that served as a chair. "Dad," she began, looking at her hands, "you're not doing this because of Nathan, are you? He left this morning. I saw him. He didn't do anything bad." Jacob tensed at the mention of the name. He didn't want to talk about Nathan, not now. But Sarah was looking at him with such sincerity that he couldn't brush it off. "It's not about him," he said, looking away. "It's just, a lot of things have come up. The farm, the debts, this stupid storm. We need to keep it all under control." Sarah nodded, but her eyes said she didn't quite believe it. She was like Emma at times like this, able to see more than he wanted to show. "Mom says you always take on too much," she said quietly. "Maybe you should just, I don't know, let go sometimes. Let us do something with her too." Jacob looked at her, and for a moment his anger eased. Sarah was right, but he couldn't afford to be weak. Not when his world seemed to be falling apart. "I'll think about it, little one," he said, trying to smile. "Go inside, or you'll get soaked to the skin. I'll be back soon." Sarah stood up, but before she left, she hugged him. Her embrace was warm, genuine, and Jacob felt something inside him soften. He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing into the rain, and he was alone again. He returned to the workbench, but his thoughts were clearer now. He would not pick a fight with Emma. Not today. He would watch, collect the pieces of truth as he would a harvest, patiently, methodically. If Ethan was the problem, he would deal with him. If Emma, he cut the thought off before it could take root. Instead, he chose to focus on what he could control. The next morning the rain had stopped, leaving behind puddles and the smell of damp earth. Jacob rose early, as usual, and began the day by exploring the farm. Sarah had already left for school on her old bike, and Emma was cooking breakfast, humming to herself. She acted as if nothing had happened, which only made him more worried. He didn't ask her about Ethan or mention the night before. Instead, he said he needed to go to the next village to check if the storm had damaged the bridge over the river. This was true, but only partly. He needed time to think, to gather his strength. The drive to the village was shorter than the one to the city, but no less picturesque. The river he spoke of flowed through a lowland, surrounded by willow trees whose branches touched the water like fingers. Jacob stopped the truck at a bridge and got out, examining the wooden beams. The bridge was old but strong, and fortunately the storm had not damaged it. He stood at the railing, looking at the water, which carried branches and leaves with it. In moments like these, he felt part of something greater than his farm, his family, his pain. The river flowed without asking questions, without demanding answers. Maybe he could learn to do that too. On his way back, he stopped by an old friend, Ben, whose farm was closer to the village. Ben was Jacob's opposite, short, stocky, with a loud laugh and a habit of talking more than he should. But he was honest, and Jacob trusted him. "Jake," Ben exclaimed, seeing him at the gate. "What brought you here? Did the storm drive you away?" "I was checking the bridge," Jacob replied, shaking his hand. "Thought I'd stop by. How are you?" Ben invited him into the house, where his wife, Martha, was already setting the table. Over a cup of coffee, Jacob inadvertently brought up Ethan. "Ethan, the guy from the farm up the hill?" Ben asked, frowning. "He's a good guy, but weird. He's always alone and rarely goes into town. They say he's tinkering with something in his barn. No one really knows what." "Making stuff?" Jacob raised an eyebrow. "What exactly?" "Who knows?" Ben shrugged. "Maybe furniture, maybe something else. He's not one to talk. But he's a hard worker, that's for sure. He helped me with the fence last month and didn't even take any money." Jacob nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Ethan seemed increasingly mysterious to him. Young, alone, showing up too often where he wasn't wanted. He thanked Ben for the coffee and walked back to the truck, his resolve growing. He wouldn't wait for the truth to surface. He would find it. When he got home, it was late afternoon. Emma was in the garden, weeding the beds. Her movements were habitual, almost automatic, but Jacob noticed her glance furtively at the road, as if she were waiting for someone. He got out of the car, carrying the bag of flour he had bought the day before, and stopped, looking at her. "Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. Emma winced, but quickly smiled. "Of course," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "I was just wondering if it would rain again. You were out for a long time." "I checked the bridge," he said, without going into details, "and I stopped by to see Ben." To Ben, Emma raised her eyebrows, but her voice remained calm. "How is he?" "As always," Jacob replied, looking into her eyes. "Talk nonstop." Emma laughed, but it was short, almost nervous. She turned back to the beds, and Jacob felt his heart tighten. He wanted to ask her about Ethan, wanted to tell her everything he'd seen, but something inside him stopped him. Not now, not like this. The evening passed quietly. Sarah came home from school, excitedly talking about the new book he had brought her. Emma set the table, and dinner was the same as always, warm, cozy, but with a hint of tension. Jacob ate in silence, watching Emma, the way she smiled at Sarah, the way her hands shook as she passed the plate. He noticed everything, but said nothing. Later, after Sarah had gone to bed and Emma was washing the dishes, Jacob walked out onto the porch. The sky was clear, the stars shining like shards of glass. He lit an old pipe, the one he only took out when he needed to think. The smoke rose into the night air, and Jacob looked at Ethan's barn in the distance. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he will talk to Ethan. Not in his house, not in front of Emma. Somewhere on neutral ground, and he would find out what was going on, even if the truth was bitter. Outside the farmhouse, the darkness thickened like ink spilled across the sky. The wind had died down, leaving only a soft breath that stirred the leaves of the old maple tree by the porch. Warm lights burned in the Wilson house, casting long shadows on the wooden walls of the living room. The aroma of roasting meat and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of lavender that always lingered around Emma. Dinner was almost ready, and the table, covered with a white cloth embroidered with daisies, looked festive despite the weekday. But Jacob's heart was not festive. He sat on the edge of his chair, his fingers clutching the handle of an old tin mug, his eyes glued to the door through which Ethan was about to enter. Jacob decided not to make a scene. Not today. He had already made up his mind, solid as granite, but his plan required patience. He would not shout. He would not ask the questions that burned inside him. Instead, he would watch, listen, gather every detail, like a farmer harvesting his crops before the long winter. Ethan, this young neighbor with his too smooth smile and eyes that seemed to see more than they said, was an enigma, and Jacob was going to solve it. Emma moved around the kitchen with her usual grace, but Jacob noticed that her hands shook slightly as she set a bowl of mashed potatoes on the table. She was humming something softly, almost inaudible, but her voice was trembling, betraying the tension. Sarah, sitting at the table with a book in her hands, was the only one who seemed serene. Her dark braid fell over her shoulder, and her eyes, as blue as her father's, sparkled with anticipation of dinner. She loved having company in the house, even if it was just a neighbor. There was a knock at the door and Emma jumped, but then smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "That must be Ethan," she said, her voice too high to sound natural. "I invited him in. He wanted to talk about something. Business." Jacob nodded, not looking up from his mug. His face was as unreadable as sun-baked earth. He didn't ask what the case was. Not now. Emma opened the door and Ethan walked in. He was wearing his usual clothes, faded jeans, a plaid shirt, slightly faded at the shoulders. His blonde hair was slightly tousled, and there was a light stubble on his cheeks, giving him the look of a man who didn't care much about his appearance, but knew how to look charming. In his hands he was holding a bottle of homemade cider, which he said he had made himself. "Good evening," he said, smiling at Emma and then looking at Jacob. "Thank you for inviting me. I hope I'm not intruding too much." "You're not in the way," Emma replied, her smile warm, but Jacob noticed how she quickly looked away. "Come in, sit down. Dinner's almost ready." Ethan nodded and handed the bottle to Jacob. "This is for you," he said, "a small gift, made from apples from my plot." Jacob took the bottle, his fingers tight around the glass. He looked at the label, simple, handwritten, neatly written. Something about the gesture, the bottle, Ethan's smile, felt too right, like it had all been rehearsed. "Thank you," he said, his voice even but steely. "Sit down." Ethan took a seat at the table across from Sarah, who immediately perked up. "Ethan, do you really make your own cider?" she asked, putting her book down. "Is it hard?" "It's not that hard if you know what you're doing," he replied, his eyes lighting up with a light laugh. "The main thing is good apples and patience. I can show you sometime if you like." "Really?" Sarah beamed. "Dad, can I go see Ethan and see how he does it?" Jacob looked at his daughter and his heart sank. She was so innocent, so open to the world, that he almost forgot his anger. But only almost. "We'll see," he replied, trying to keep his voice soft. "We need to sort out my homework first." Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled. "You always say that, Dad." Emma set a plate of roast meat on the table, and the conversation fell silent for a moment. Everyone turned to eating, but the silence was tense, like a taut string. Jacob ate slowly, watching Ethan's every move. He was polite, almost too polite, thanking each dish, praising Emma's cooking, and joking with Sarah. But Jacob saw how his gaze sometimes lingered on Emma a little longer than necessary, and how Emma, as if by accident, touched his hand when passing him a bowl of salad. "So what was it you wanted to talk about?" Jacob asked, finally putting down his fork. His voice was calm, but there was a threat in it, like distant thunder. Ethan cleared his throat, placing his mug of cider on the table. "Yeah, right," he began, his tone light, but Jacob noticed his fingers tighten slightly. "I was thinking maybe we could join forces. I've got an old tractor I fixed up. It's not new, but it pulls well, and I heard you have a field down south that's not working. Maybe we could plant some barley together. We'll split the harvest." Jacob narrowed his eyes. The offer sounded reasonable, even advantageous. But something about it, the way Ethan spoke, the way he looked at him, made Jacob feel like he was being tested. "The field to the south," he repeated slowly. "How do you know it's idle?" Ethan shrugged, his smile disarming. "The neighbors are chatting," he said, "and you can see it from the road. The weeds are already knee-high there." Emma intervened, her voice soft but insistent. "Jacob, that's a good idea," she said, looking at him with a slight smile. "We could use the extra harvest. Debts won't pay themselves." Jacob looked at her, and the fire in his chest flared again. She was protecting Ethan. Or was that just his imagination? He forced himself to smile, though it was hard. "I'll think about it," he said, cutting off a piece of meat. "But you know how I feel about other people's tractors on my land." Ethan laughed, but it was short, almost nervous. "I understand," he said. "But the offer still stands. If you change your mind, let me know." Dinner went on, but the conversation became less frequent, more abrupt. Sarah tried to liven things up by talking about the school play in which she had a supporting role, but even her enthusiasm couldn't completely ease the tension. Jacob was silent, watching. He noticed everything: the way Ethan offered to help Emma with the dishes, the way she declined, but with a smile, the way their eyes met when they thought he wasn't looking. Every gesture, every word, was imprinted in his memory like stones in a foundation. When dinner was over, Ethan stood up, thanking them for their hospitality. "I have to go," he said, putting on his jacket. "Thank you, Emma. It was delicious." "Jacob, think about the field. It could be beneficial for both of us." "I'll think about it," Jacob repeated, his voice as cold as the night air outside. Emma walked Ethan to the door, and Jacob heard them exchange a few quiet words. He couldn't make out what they said, but the tone was too warm, too personal. When Emma returned, she began clearing the table without looking at him. "It's a nice evening," she said, her voice light but taut. "Really?" "Yes," Jacob replied, standing up. "Good." He stepped out onto the porch without another word. The night was cold, the stars were bright, but inside he was dark. He lit his pipe, blowing smoke into the air, and looked down the road Ethan had taken. His mind was made up. Tomorrow he will go to Ethan, not to talk about tractors or barley. He wanted the truth, and he would get it, no matter what it took. Dawn was breaking through the thin veil of fog that hung over the fields around the Wilson farm. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and grass, and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog wove into the morning stillness like thread through rough fabric. Jacob stood on the porch, his breath mingling with the steam rising from his mug of black coffee. He looked out over his fields, at the neat rows of corn he planted with such care that they seemed an extension of himself. But today his gaze was distant, fixed somewhere beyond the horizon, where his mind had been spinning a web of plans he hadn't told anyone about for days. The decision he had made that night after dinner with Ethan hadn't been an impulse. It had been a seed he had planted in his soul, and now it was growing, taking root in his every action. Jacob was not a man to act rashly, but he was also not one to let circumstances dictate his life. He had seen the shadow of doubt fall over his family, over his home, over everything he had spent decades building. Ethan, with his easy smile and his too frequent visits, was just one part of that shadow. But Jacob knew that a shadow doesn't come without a source. And he was going to find that source, uproot it like a weed, and protect what was his, even if it meant destroying everything he knew. He finished his coffee, the bitter taste burning his throat, and went back into the house. Emma was still asleep, her face softened by sleep, looking almost young in the morning light. Sarah had ridden off to school on her bike, leaving a note on the table. "Don't forget your book about pirates, Dad." Jacob smiled, but it was as short as a flash of lightning. He couldn't afford to be distracted by warm memories. He had work to do, and it didn't tolerate delay. The first thing he did was head to his office, a small room in the corner of the house where all the farm's paperwork was kept. The old wooden desk was piled high with papers: seed bills, fuel receipts, grain sales records. Jacob sat down, opening a drawer to reveal his checkbook and an old notebook where he kept track of his finances. The farm wasn't just his home, it was his life, his legacy, but he saw it differently now, as a tool, as a means to rewrite the rules of the game. He started small. He had an account at a local bank 30 miles from the farm that received money from the sale of his crops. It was a modest sum, but over the years he had saved enough to cover his basic expenses. Jacob called the bank and, keeping a calm tone, asked that some of the funds be transferred to another account, an account he had opened in the name of an old friend, a veteran named Lucas Hart. Lucas was a man Jacob trusted as much as he trusted himself. They had met as young men when they had both worked on farms in neighboring counties. Lucas had been wounded in the army, had lost a leg, and now lived in a small house on the edge of town, repairing old cars. He was a man of few words, but loyal as a rock, and never asked unnecessary questions. "Lucas," Jacob said when he picked up the phone. His voice was firm, but there was a slight rasp to it that betrayed the tension. "I need your help." "Name it," Lucas said without further ado. His voice was low, with a slight accent he had picked up somewhere in the South, where he had served. "I'm transferring money to your account. Small amounts, so no one will notice, and I need you to keep it there. No questions asked." There was a pause on the other end of the line, but Lucas didn't argue. "Got it," he said. "How much?" 10,000 to start with, then more. I'll tell you when." "Okay," Lucas replied. "But Jake, are you sure you know what you're doing?" "I know," Jacob said, and there was no doubt in his voice. "Just keep it a secret, even from Emma." Lucas chuckled, but didn't argue. They said goodbye, and Jacob hung up, feeling like the first step had been taken. He didn't know how far his plan would go, but he knew it was too late to back out. The next step was cattle. Jacob had a small herd of cows, only 20, but each one was part of his operation. He decided to sell half of them, but not at the local market, where everyone knew him. Instead, he contacted a buyer in a neighboring county, introducing himself through an intermediary. He explained that he was renovating the farm, that he wanted to replace the old cattle with more productive ones. It was a plausible story. Many farmers did this, and no one would suspect a trick. The money for the cows, almost $15,000, also went into Lucas's account. Jacob made the deal under a false name, using old connections he had from his fair days. He was careful, like a hunter stalking his prey, knowing that one false move could ruin everything. The equipment was next. The old tractor he fixed up with his own hands every season was still running, but Jacob decided it had to go too. He contacted a dealer in town, offering to sell the tractor for cash, again under the guise of an upgrade. The dealer, an older man named Hank, was happy with the deal. He knew Jacob's equipment was always in good condition. The money he got for the tractor also went to Lucas. Jacob was leaving no trace that could lead back to him. He knew Emma would check the accounts if she became suspicious. She was smart, too smart to not notice if he was acting overtly. He did it all with cold calculation, but inside, a fire was raging. Every action, transferring the money, selling the cow, calling Lucas, was like a hammer on the anvil of his anger. He couldn't forget the image he'd seen in the bedroom. Emma, her laughter, Ethan standing too close. He didn't know what was between them, but it was enough to make his world crack like dry earth under a blazing sun. He didn't want to believe Emma was capable of betrayal, but doubt, once it took root, grew like a weed, and he couldn't let that weed choke his life. By midday, Jacob had finished his work in the office and was out in the field. He decided to do some work to distract himself. The field to the south that Ethan had mentioned was indeed overgrown with weeds. Jacob picked up a hoe and began pulling out the weeds, feeling how the physical labor helped him keep his thoughts in check. The ground was damp from the rain, and the hoe cut into it easily, but each blow echoed in his chest like an echo of his pain. "Dad!" Sarah's voice rang out. She was running across the field, her school bag bouncing on her shoulder. "Why are you here alone? I thought you were in the barn?" Jacob straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I decided to take up this field," he replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "Why are you here so early? Is school over already?" "Yes, the teacher got sick. They let her go early," Sarah said, coming closer. She looked at the field, her brows furrowing. "You said you wouldn't touch this field this year." "Changed my mind," Jacob said, jabbing his hoe into the ground. "We need to do something about it. Maybe we can plant barley, like Ethan suggested." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Ethan? Have you talked to him?" There was curiosity in her voice, but Jacob also noticed a hint of concern. "He came yesterday," he answered, trying not to show his feelings. "He suggested that we sow this field together. I said I'd think about it." "Cool," Sarah exclaimed, her face lighting up with a smile. "He's so cool, isn't he? He told me about his apple trees, says he can teach me how to make cider." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. He didn't want Sarah to be that close to Ethan. Not now, when he didn't know what to think of the man himself. "We'll see," he said, returning to work. "Go home and help your mother. She's probably already cooking something." Sarah nodded and ran toward the house, leaving Jacob alone. He watched her go, his heart clenching. Sarah was his light, his hope, and the thought of her being caught up in his plans was unbearable. But he couldn't stop. Not now. By evening, he had finished the field and returned to the house. Emma was in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, and there was pie dough on the table. She looked at him, her eyes warm, but there was a hint of worry in them. "You've been out in the field all day," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing," Jacob said, taking off his hat. "Just thinking about tidying up the south field. Maybe Ethan's right, it's time to use it." Emma froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Have you talked to him?" "Not directly," Jacob said, looking into her eyes. "But his idea isn't so bad. I'll think about it." Emma nodded, but her smile was strained. She turned back to the stove, and Jacob felt his heart tighten again. He wanted to ask her, wanted to tell her everything he had seen, everything he had suspected, but instead he sat silently at the table, watching her. Dinner was quiet. Sarah chatted about school, about the new book she had started reading, but Jacob barely listened. His mind was elsewhere. He imagined the money going into Lucas's account, the cows disappearing from the farm, the tractor he had fixed with his own hands, now sitting in someone else's barn. Each step was part of a plan he didn't yet fully understand, but which was leading him to something inevitable. When Sarah had gone to bed and Emma had started washing the dishes, Jacob stood up and walked over to her. He put his hand on her shoulder, feeling her tense under his touch. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, "we need to talk. Not now, but soon." She turned to him, her eyes full of questions, but she only nodded. "Okay," she said, "whenever you're ready." Jacob nodded and stepped out onto the porch. The night was dark, moonless, and only the stars twinkled like distant lighthouses. He lit his pipe, looking out at the field where he had worked that day. He knew the soil was ready, not for barley, not for corn, for something else, for the truth he would find even if it tore his world apart. The autumn air was thick with the scent of ripe wheat and the dampness that rose from the earth from the recent rains. The fields around the Wilson farm were golden in the morning sun, their heads swaying in the wind like waves on a sea Jacob had only seen in pictures in Sarah's books. He stood at the edge of his largest field, the one that stretched to the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a haze of distant hills. His hands, rough from decades of work, gripped the handle of a sickle. Though he rarely used it, the combine was faster, more efficient. But today he wanted to feel the earth, its weight, its resistance. He wanted every stroke to remind him of who he was and what he was doing. Harvesting was a ritual for Jacob, almost a sacred act. It was the moment when the land gave him back what he had put into its sweat, time, hope. But this year was different. He wasn't going to take his grain to the local co-op, as he had every season for 20 years. The co-op was the heart of the farming community, a place where neighbors met, where they traded news, where they discussed prices and the weather. But Jacob no longer trusted the place, the curious glances and the whispers behind his back. He saw the way people looked at him, at Emma, at Ethan, who was now in their lives more often than they would have liked. He heard the whispers about Emma smiling too much at her younger neighbor, about Jacob becoming more sullen, about something not quite right at the Wilson farm. And he decided that this crop would never see the co-op. He would sell it for cash, bypassing anyone who might ask questions. Jacob began the harvest early that morning, before the sun had even risen above the horizon. He rented an old truck from a man in the next county, introducing himself through a third party. It was a beat-up Ford with peeling paint and an engine that coughed like a chain smoker, but it got the job done. Jacob loaded the sacks of wheat, carefully counting each one to make sure there were no traces. He worked alone, without hiring laborers as he had in years past. He didn't even call Lucas, who had offered to help. This was too personal, too important, to trust anyone else. The buyer was waiting for him 40 miles away, in an abandoned warehouse along an old railroad siding. Jacob had found him through old connections, people who didn't ask questions or care why a farmer with a good reputation would suddenly decide to sell grain for cash. The buyer, a short man with thinning hair and a sharp gaze, gave his name only as Tony. He wore a shabby jacket that looked like it had been worn since the Great Depression, and he was smoking a cigarette, blowing smoke into the chill morning air. "How much do you have?" Tony asked, looking at the bags stacked in the back of the truck. 50 tons, Jacob replied, his voice even but tense. "First-grade wheat. Check it out, if you like." Tony chuckled, walked over to one of the sacks, and untied it. He scooped up a handful of grain, rubbing it between his fingers as if testing the gold for authenticity. "It looks good," he said, glancing at Jacob. "But you realize the cash price will be lower than the co-op price?" "I understand," Jacob nodded. "Name your price." Tony named a figure that was nearly a third below market value, but Jacob didn't haggle. He wanted money that was clean and unmonitored, that wouldn't leave a trace in any bank accounts. He agreed, and Tony, without saying anything else, pulled a thick wad of bills from his pocket, wrapped in a rubber band. Jacob counted the money, feeling its weight settle in his palms, another piece of his plan coming to fruition. He tucked the wad into an old tin tobacco box he kept in the glove compartment and drove away without looking back. As he walked home, he looked at the road that wound between the fields like a ribbon linking his past and his future. He thought about how everything had changed in the last few weeks. His life, once so simple and clear, was now like a field overgrown with weeds. Ethan, with his easy smiles and offers of cooperation, was the biggest weed of all. But Jacob wasn't going to pull him out by the roots, not yet. He wanted to understand what was going on, wanted to put all the pieces of the puzzle together before he took the final step. The money he'd hidden, the cows that had disappeared, the tractor sold for next to nothing, all of it was part of the preparation. For what? He wasn't sure yet, but he felt like the answer was close. The house greeted him with a silence that was louder than any noise. Emma was in the garden, her figure flitting between the beds where she was picking the last of the autumn vegetables. Her hair, pulled back into a messy bun, glistened in the sun, and her face was focused, almost stern. Jacob watched her from the kitchen window, and his heart sank. He loved her so much that the pain of it was almost physical. But he couldn't shake the image he'd seen in the bedroom. Her laughter, her eyes sparkling as she spoke to Ethan. He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't ignore it. "You're early," Emma said when he came out into the garden to join her. Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of wariness in it. "I thought you'd be out in the field until the evening." "Finished early," Jacob said, squatting down next to her. He picked up the carrots she just pulled from the ground and began to clean them of clumps of dirt. "Handed in the wheat. Good crop this year." Emma looked at him, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Already?" she asked. "You didn't say you were going to the co-op." "Not to the co-op," he said, trying to make his voice sound natural. "Found a buyer. Best price." Emma nodded, but her gaze lingered on him a little longer than usual. She was smart, too smart not to notice that he was holding something back. But she didn't ask, and simply returned to her garden, her movements a little more abrupt than necessary. "Okay," she said finally. "The extra money wouldn't hurt us." Jacob remained silent, continuing to peel the carrots. He wanted to say something to her, wanted to ask, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he stood up and went into the house to take care of business. There, in the quiet of his study, he hid the tin box of money in the old safe that stood in the corner. The safe was heavy, rusty, but reliable, like everything Jacob valued. He turned the key, feeling the lock click, locking away another part of his plan. The day passed in its usual routine. Sarah returned from school, her cheeks flushed from the wind, her eyes shining with the news. She told him about how her friend Mary had won the poetry contest and how she was going to enter the next one herself. Jacob listened, smiling, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about Lucas, about the money, about the grain that was now sitting in someone else's warehouse. He thought about Ethan, whose farm loomed on the hill, a reminder that he had not yet figured everything out. That evening, when the sun had set and the sky had turned a deep indigo, Emma began to prepare dinner. She was quieter than usual, her movements mechanical, as if she were doing the job automatically. Jacob noticed this, but did not comment. He helped her set the table, feeling the silence between them growing heavier. "Are you okay?" Emma asked as they sat down at the table. Her voice was soft, but there was concern in it. "Yeah," Jacob said, cutting off a piece of bread. "Just tired. Lots of work." Emma looked at him, her eyes searching his face, but she didn't press the issue. Sarah, as always, brought life to the dinner, talking about her day, about her books, about her dreams. She was their sun, their light, and Jacob felt her voice soften his pain, at least for a while. After supper, he went out on the porch, as he did every night. He lit his pipe, looking at the stars that seemed so far away, so indifferent. He thought about what he was doing, about the money he had hidden, about the cattle he had sold, about the grain that had gone for cash. He knew that these were not just actions. This was his harvest, not wheat, not barley, but something deeper, more personal. He was collecting truth, collecting his life, collecting himself. And when the time came, he would decide what to do with this harvest. Night had fallen thickly over the Wilson farm, as if someone had thrown heavy velvet over the world to block out all sounds but the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. The moon hung low, a thin crescent, its pale light reflecting off the puddles left by a recent rain. Jacob stood by his old pickup truck, parked near the barn, his silhouette part of the darkness, the faint glow of the flashlight giving away the movement of his hands. He was loading the last of his belongings into the back, moving with the same methodical precision he had used to till his fields all his life. Each item he packed wasn't just a thing, it was a fragment of his past, taking it with him as he left everything else behind. There were already several boxes in the back of the truck, one filled with family photographs, yellowed with age, but still warm from the days when he, Emma, and Sarah had been one. Another with his personal tools, a hammer, chisels, an old plane he'd inherited from his father that still smelled of wood and oil. Last, he'd put down his grandfather's shotgun, heavy and darkened by age, which hung over the living room fireplace like a silent guardian of their home. He'd wrapped it in old canvas, as if he were afraid that even in the darkness, it might betray his intentions. The gun hadn't fired in decades, but Jacob could feel its weight not just in his hands, but in his soul. It was a symbol, a reminder that he could still protect what was dear to him, or destroy it. The house was silent, so quiet it felt like time had stopped. Emma slept in their bedroom, her breathing barely audible through the cracked door. Sarah, exhausted from a day of school and reading her new pirate book, was curled up in her room, hugging the old stuffed animal Jacob had given her for her 5th birthday. He didn't come over to say goodbye. Saying goodbye would have been too hard, too final. Instead, he moved silently, like a shadow, gathering up the last pieces of his life he could carry. On the kitchen table, he had left the keys to the house, old and worn, tied to them with a leather cord Emma had made herself in the first year of their marriage. Next to the keys was an envelope, plain, white, unmarked. Inside were the papers he had prepared over the past weeks, papers transferring the farm to the bank to cover debts Emma had no idea about. Debts he had created by selling cattle, machinery, grain, transferring money to Lucas's account. This was his final move, his way of severing his connection to the land that had been his life, but that now felt like a cage. He didn't know how Emma would react when she found this envelope. Would she cry, scream, curse him, or simply remain silent, as she had been silent all these weeks, while he had become more and more withdrawn, more and more distant? Jacob closed the barn door, taking one last look around the interior. He had spent so many hours here, surrounded by the smells of hay and old wood and machine oil, that they had blurred into one endless memory. He saw himself as a young man, with Emma laughing at his clumsy attempts to fix the plow. He saw Sarah, a little girl, running through the haystacks, her laughter ringing like a bell. But now those memories were like old photographs, vivid but distant, unreachable. He turned and walked toward the truck, his steps heavy but determined. He took one last look at the house as he climbed behind the wheel. The lights had long since gone out, and the house seemed asleep, vulnerable. Jacob felt something tighten in his chest, but he forced himself to turn away. He started the engine, and the old Ford rumbled into the quiet of the night. The road ahead was dark, winding like his thoughts, but he knew where he was going. Not to the city, not to Lucas, not to any of his old friends. He was going to a place where he could start over, where he could make sense of what had happened to his life, to his family, to himself. The road wound through fields he knew better than the lines on his palms. Every tree, every bump, every turn was part of his world, but now it felt alien. He turned on the radio, but got only static, hissing like ghosts. He turned it off and concentrated on the road, on the way the headlights picked up bits of asphalt out of the darkness, like pieces of his shattered life. The plan he had been building for the last few weeks was spinning in his head, transferring the money to Lucas's account, selling the cattle, the machinery, the grain. It wasn't just an attempt to cover his tracks. It was a way to free himself, to throw off the burden of the farm that had become both his home and his prison. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't stay. Not after what he had seen in the bedroom, not after the doubt that had taken root in his heart. Ethan, with his easy smile and his too frequent visits, was only part of the problem. But behind him was Emma, her laughter, her looks, her silence, and Jacob couldn't live with that anymore. He pulled the truck to the side of the road, a few miles from the farm, and got out to breathe in the night air. The cold was in his bones, but he ignored it. He looked up at the stars that shone overhead like shards of hope, and thought about what he had left behind. The envelope on the table had been his last words, his goodbye. There was no letter, no explanation. Just papers, cold and official, like his decision. He knew Emma would be shocked, that Sarah would not understand why he had left. But he couldn't help it. He couldn't look into their eyes, knowing his world was crumbling. "I'm sorry," he muttered to the stars, to the night, to himself. His voice was hoarse, almost broken, but he pulled himself together quickly. He was not a man to allow himself weakness. He was a farmer, a man of the land, a man of action, and he would do what he had to do. Back in the truck, he pulled out the old tin box where he kept the money he'd earned from selling grain. He counted it, feeling the paper slide under his fingers. This wasn't just money, this was his freedom, his chance to start over. He tucked the box under the seat and pulled away, heading for the highway that led north. Where exactly, he hadn't decided yet. Maybe to Lucas, who was waiting for him in his house on the edge of town. Maybe further, where no one knew his name, where he could be someone else. The night of leaving was quiet, but there was something deafening about the silence. Jacob felt his heart beat like the engine, his thoughts swirling like the wind outside the window. He didn't look back, didn't allow himself to think about what he had left behind. He knew the morning would bring pain to Emma and Sarah, but he hoped they would understand. Someday, he hoped they would find the strength to live without him, as he had tried to find the strength to live without them. When the first rays of dawn began to break through the darkness, Jacob was already far from the farm. The road before him was endless, like his doubts, but he rode forward, never stopping. He had left everything he knew, everything he loved, but he did not feel empty. He felt free, although this freedom was bitter, like the coffee he drank every morning. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this night was not the end. This was just a new sowing, a new harvest that he had yet to reap. Dawn crept into the Wilson house like an uninvited guest, creeping cautiously through the cracks in the curtains. The light was soft, almost timid, but it could not hide the emptiness that now reigned in the house. Emma awoke to silence, not the usual morning silence, when the world was still asleep, but an oppressive, almost tangible silence that seemed to squeeze her chest. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, where the familiar cracks seemed alien today, as if someone had redrawn them overnight. Jacob was not there. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets neatly tucked in, as if he had never lain down at all. Emma frowned, her fingers sliding over the empty space where his hand usually lay, heavy and warm, like an anchor holding her to this world. She stood up, pulling on an old wool robe that smelled of lavender and thyme. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet, but the sound, usually so familiar, seemed foreign to her today, like an echo in an abandoned house. She went into the kitchen, expecting to find Jacob at the table with his ever-present mug of coffee, but the kitchen was empty. On the table were the keys, old ones with the leather cord she had made for him in the early years of their marriage. Next to it was an envelope, plain and unmarked, like a silent messenger. Emma froze, her heart pounding, but she hesitated before taking it. Instead, she went to the window, hoping to see Jacob's truck at the barn or his figure in the field, but the yard was empty. No truck, no cows, not even the old tractor that always sat under the shed like a faithful dog. She returned to the desk, her fingers shaking as she opened the envelope. Inside were documents, dry and official, with seals and signatures she couldn't immediately decipher. But the words that caught her eye were like a blow: transfer of title, bank, debts. Emma reread them, her breath coming in short gasps. The farm, their home, their life, all of it now belonged to the bank. Debts she knew nothing about, debts Jacob must have been hiding from her all these months. She sank into a chair, feeling the world crumble around her, the land they had farmed together slipping away from beneath her feet. Emma stood up, her movements almost mechanical, and walked through the house as if hoping to find answers in familiar places. But the house was not what she remembered. The living room, where she and Jacob had spent evenings by the fire, was almost empty. The bookcase he had made with his own hands was gone. The shelf that had held the photographs their wedding, Sarah's first steps, a family picnic by the river was bare. Even the old rocking chair she had loved to read in was gone. Emma felt her throat tighten, but no tears came. Instead, something else was growing inside her, a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. She went up to Sarah's bedroom, terrified of what she might find there. But Sarah was there, asleep, her dark braid lying like a shadow on the pillow. Emma stood in the doorway, looking at her daughter, and her heart sank with relief. At least Sarah was here. At least she hadn't disappeared like everything else. Emma closed the door quietly and returned to the living room, her steps slow, as if she were afraid to break the eerie silence. She saw something shiny on the kitchen windowsill. As she came closer, she saw a ring, her wedding ring, the one she took off only at night and left on the nightstand. Now it lay there on the cold windowsill, as if abandoned, like an unwanted object. Emma picked it up, her fingers shaking as she held it up to the light. It was a simple gold ring, no stones, no frills, but to her it was a symbol of her and Jacob's life. He had put it on her finger 20 years ago, under the maple tree by the river, when they were young and full of hope. Now it lay there, like a period at the end of their story. There was no letter, no note, no word. Only a silence that screamed louder than any explanation. Emma clenched the ring in her fist, feeling the metal dig into her skin. She wanted to scream, to smash something, but instead she just stood there, looking out the window where the morning light was pouring into the empty yard. Sarah would wake up soon, and she would have to explain that their father was gone, that the farm was no longer theirs, that the life they knew had disappeared overnight. Emma didn't know how she would do it, but she knew she had to. For Sarah, for herself. She went to the barn, hoping to find something there that might give her a clue. But the barn was empty, like the house. Jacob's tools, his workbench, even the old sacks of grain were gone. Only the smell of hay and dust suggested that there had once been life here. Emma leaned against the wall, her shoulders slumped, and for the first time that morning, she allowed herself to cry. The tears were quiet, almost inaudible, but they burned her face like fire. She wasn't crying just for Jacob, not just for the farm. She was crying for herself, for not noticing how he was growing distant, how his eyes were growing colder, how his silence was growing heavier. When the tears had dried up, Emma wiped her face with her sleeve and went back into the house. She made coffee in the old copper pot Jacob loved and sat at the table, staring at the envelope. She read the papers again, trying to understand how all this had happened. The debts she hadn't known about were enormous hundreds of thousands of dollars accumulated over the years that he had never spoken about. She remembered how he had become withdrawn in recent months, how his answers had become shorter, how he spent hours in the barn or the fields, avoiding her gaze. She had thought it was because he was tired, because of the storms, because of the cares of the farm. Now she realized it was more than that. Sarah appeared in the kitchen, her eyes sleepy, but she immediately noticed that something was wrong. "Mom," she asked, her voice quiet, almost scared. "Where's Dad?" Emma looked at her daughter, her heart sank. She wanted to lie, to say that he had gone away on business, that he would be back in the evening, but the truth was too hard to hide. "He's gone, honey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know where, but he left this." She pointed to the envelope. Sarah walked up to the desk, her movements slow, as if she was afraid of what she would see. She picked up the papers, her fingers shaking as she flipped through them. Her face went pale, her eyes filled with tears. "The farm," she whispered. "It's not ours anymore." Emma nodded, unable to speak. She stood and hugged Sarah, feeling her daughter tremble in her arms. They stood there for a long time, pressed together, until the morning light grew brighter, filling the kitchen with a cold glow. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "We'll manage," Emma replied, though she didn't believe her own words. "We always have." She pulled back, looking into her daughter's eyes. They held the same strength as her own, the same spark that never faded even in the darkest of times. Emma knew they had a long way to go, that they would have to find answers, deal with the debt, with the bank, with the void Jacob had left. But she also knew they weren't alone. They had each other, and that was more than Jacob had, wherever he was. Emma picked up the ring from the windowsill and slipped it onto her finger. It felt cold but familiar, a reminder that she was still alive, still able to fight. She looked at Sarah and smiled, though it was hard. "Come on," she said. "We need to go into town, to sort out the bank, the paperwork, and maybe find someone who knows where your father went." Sarah nodded, her eyes still shining with tears, but with a new determination. They walked out of the house, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any words. The morning of emptiness was just the beginning, and Emma knew there was much more to learn about Jacob, about his plans, about what had made him leave. But as they walked toward Sarah's old bike, the only thing left in the yard, Emma felt that they were not broken. They were like the earth after a drought cracked, but still capable of sprouting, and they would find their way even if it was long and thorny. The road west stretched before Jacob like an endless ribbon, winding across the plains where the wind blew dust across the ground like ghosts of a summer gone by. His old pickup, battered by years of farming, purred beneath him like a faithful steed that knows the way but asks no questions. The sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky shades of gold and scarlet, and Jacob squinted at the blaze of light that seemed to him like the promise of a new beginning. He was heading toward Wyoming, or maybe Montana. He had no plan, only a vague memory of a piece of land. His father had left him in his will many years ago. It was a wild, unsettled land, covered in sagebrush and surrounded by mountains that his father had said held a silence that could heal any soul. In the back of the truck were boxes of his past life, family photos, tools, his grandfather's shotgun. Each object was an anchor, holding him to the world he'd left behind, but it was also his ticket to the future, to a place where he could start over. Jacob felt a lightness he hadn't felt in years. It was as if the heavy burdens of the farm, the debts, the doubts, the pain, were still there in the house, along with the keys and the envelope he'd left on the kitchen table. He didn't know how Emma and Sarah would take his departure, but he hoped that one day they would understand. He hadn't run away. He'd set them free, and he'd set himself free. Or so he told himself. The drive was long, and Jacob took his time. He drove slowly, letting the landscape around him fill his thoughts. The fields he knew like the back of his hand gave way to rolling hills of stiff grass, then to wide open plains where the sky seemed so big it could swallow a man whole. He turned on the radio, but instead of music, all he heard was static and snatches of sermons that sounded like voices from another world. He turned it off and opened the window, letting the wind rush into the cabin, bringing with it the sense of earth and grass and freedom. Freedom, he murmured, and the word sounded strange, almost foreign, spoken aloud. He wasn't sure that was what he felt, but it was close. He had thrown off the weight of the farm, the weight of suspicion, the weight of Ethan, whose shadow still loomed in his mind. He didn't know what Emma had done to this young neighbor, but he knew he couldn't stay to find out. Not now. Not when every look Emma gave him, every laugh she shared with Ethan, cut him like a knife. He stopped at a gas station somewhere on the Nebraska-Wyoming border. It was a rundown place with a peeling sign and a single pump that looked like it hadn't been repaired since the Depression. An old man in a faded baseball cap sat behind the counter and looked at Jacob with mild curiosity, but didn't ask any questions. Jacob filled up the tank, bought a bottle of water, and a pack of jerky that smelled of salt and smoke. He sat on the hood of the truck, looking out at the road that disappeared into the hazy horizon. "Where are you headed?" the old man asked, walking out of the gas station with a cigarette in his hand. His voice was as hoarse as the gravel beneath his feet. "To the west," Jacob answered without going into details. "There's land there. I want to see what's happening to it." The old man nodded, taking a drag on his cigarette. His eyes, faded by sun and time, looked at Jacob with an understanding that needed no words. "The earth is good," he said. "It always waits. Just don't forget that it can be as stubborn as a man." Jacob grinned, but there was no joy in his grin. He knew the old man was right. The land he was riding out to find wasn't just a plot of land with boundaries on a map. It was his inheritance, his chance to start over, but it was also his test. He thanked the old man, climbed into the truck, and continued on his way, feeling the road beneath his wheels grow wilder, more alien. By midday, the landscape had changed. The flatlands gave way to hills, then to mountains, their peaks capped with snow despite the autumn. Jacob stopped at the side of the road to eat. He pulled an old photograph out of a drawer, one of him, Emma, and Sarah standing by the river, laughing over something he could no longer remember. Emma was wearing a blue dress, her hair blowing in the wind, and Sarah, still a toddler, was holding his hand. Jacob stared at the photograph, his throat tightening. He wouldn't let himself cry. He hadn't cried since his father died, but the pain was so sharp he could almost feel it. He put the photograph back in the drawer and pulled out the map he'd found among his father's things. It was old, tattered paper with pencil marks and coffee stains. His father had talked about land in Wyoming, somewhere near the Bighorn Mountains, but he hadn't left any exact coordinates. Jacob only knew the general direction, a small town called Sheridan, where his family was rumored to have an old claim. He'd never been there, but his father had told him it was a wild, untouched place with a river so clear you could drink straight from it. Jacob didn't know if that was true, but he wanted to believe. He needed something to believe in. The road narrowed, turning from asphalt to gravel and then to packed dirt. The truck bounced over the bumps, but Jacob ignored it. He felt the lightness in his chest grow with every mile that separated him from the farm, from Emma, from Ethan. He didn't know what lay ahead, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, he wasn't tied to the land, to debt, to expectations. He was free, and that freedom, though bitter, was like a sip of cold water after a long day in the hot sun. By late afternoon, he had reached Sheridan. It was a small town, wedged between mountains and plains, with a main street lined with old brick buildings and a couple of cafes that smelled of fried bacon. Jacob parked at a small motel with a sign that said, "The Western Star," its neon lights blinking despite the early hour. He checked into a room, paying cash from a tin, and walked into a room that smelled of dust and cheap soap. He threw his backpack on the bed and sat looking out the window, where the mountains darkened against the sunset sky. "What next, Jake?" he asked himself, his voice rough with fatigue and long silence. He didn't know the answer, but he felt like he was close to something important. The land he was looking for was out there, and he would find it. Not for the crops, not for the money, for himself. He pulled his grandfather's shotgun out of the drawer and laid it on the table. It looked almost ominous in the dim lamplight, but to Jacob it was more than just a piece of metal. It was a reminder of his roots, that he was still Wilson, still his father's son. He ran his fingers along the barrel, feeling the cold metal, and thought about how far he had come from the boy who dreamed of big fields and a simple life. Now here he was, at the edge of the world, with a box of memories and a heart full of questions. The night was restless. Jacob tossed and turned on his hard bed, his dreams full of faces: Emma, Sarah, Ethan, his father. He woke before dawn, feeling the weariness in his bones, but the lightness in his soul. He got ready quickly, got coffee at a cafe across the street, and went to the local land office to inquire about his inheritance. The woman behind the counter, an older woman with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun, looked at him with mild surprise when he mentioned his father's name. "Wilson, you say?" she repeated, leafing through a thick folder of documents. "Yes, there is a property, a small one, about 50 acres, by the Tong River. But it is abandoned, you know. No one has been there since your father left." "This is what I need," Jacob said, his voice firm but hopeful. She gave him a map and some paperwork that proved his right to the land. Jacob thanked her and walked back to the truck, his heart beating faster. He was close. The land was waiting for him, like the old man at the gas station had said, and he was ready to meet it. The road to the property was narrow, almost overgrown, but Jacob drove slowly, enjoying every turn. When he finally reached the site, the sun was high, bathing the plain in golden light. The land stretched out before him, wild and untouched, with a river that glittered like silver and mountains that stood like sentinels on the horizon. He stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking into the soft soil, and breathed in air that was so pure it seemed alive. "This is it," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind. He felt the lightness in his chest become almost tangible, as if he had finally cast off all the chains. There was no Emma here, no Ethan, no debt. Just him and the earth and the endless sky. He didn't know what he would do with this place, but he knew it was his, and that was enough. Jacob sat down on the grass, took the photograph out of the drawer, and looked at it again. Emma, Sarah, himself, a happy family that no longer existed. He didn't know if he would ever return to them, but in that moment, sitting on his new land, he felt like he had made the right choice. The road to the west had brought him here, and now he was ready to start over, even if it meant living with pain that would never go away. The sun was rising over Wyoming, casting a soft gold across the plain that was reflected in the Tongue River near Jacob's property. The morning air was crisp, with a hint of sagebrush and pine needles blown in from the distant mountains. Jacob stood at the edge of his new world, 50 acres of wilderness, covered in tall grass and strewn with boulders that seemed to have been thrown there by the hand of a giant. His pickup truck, parked by an old oak tree, was the only reminder of civilization, but even that, covered in the dust and dirt of the long drive, seemed part of the landscape. Jacob took a deep breath, feeling the lightness that had been born in him on the way here now take root like a seed in rich soil. He was alone, but the loneliness was not heavy. It was as honest as the ground beneath his feet, as the sky above his head, as his own heart, which, despite the pain, still beat. He left the farm, Emma, Sarah, leaving behind only the envelope with the papers and the ring on the windowsill. He did not shout, did not make a scene, did not raise a hand against Ethan, whose shadow still loomed in his memory. He did not spill blood, did not break a single pane of glass. But the punishment he had chosen, leaving, silence, disappearance, was harsher than any words or blows. He knew that Emma would wake up to an empty house, that Sarah would search for him in the barn, in the field, in every corner of their lives, and would not find him. He knew that his leaving would break their hearts, as his own had broken when he saw Emma and Ethan in their bedroom, heard her laugh, saw her eyes sparkle in a way they had not sparkled for him in years. But he could not stay. He could not live with the doubt that was eating away at him like rust. And now, standing on his new land, he felt that he had acted fairly not in relation to them, but in relation to himself. Jacob got his old toolbox out of the back of his truck and began laying it out on the grass. The hammer, the chisels, the plane, these things were his companions, his extensions. He didn't know what he would build on this land, but he knew he would start small. Maybe a cabin, simple enough to keep out the wind and rain. Maybe a fence to mark the boundaries of his new world. He was in no hurry. Time, his enemy on the farm, was his ally here. Each day was a blank slate, and he could write on it whatever he wanted. The first thing he did was to scout out the property. He walked along the river, whose water was so clear that he could see the rocks at the bottom, polished smooth by the current. The river sang its song, low and melodious, and Jacob stopped, squatting to scoop up water. It was cold, almost icy, but he drank it down, feeling it wash away the dust of the road, the dust of the past. He looked at his reflection in the water, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes that still held the blue of the sky, but were now touched by weariness. He was not old, but he felt older than his 45 years. Life on the farm, fighting droughts, debts, and now betrayal, had all left their marks. He walked back to the truck and pulled out the map the Sheridan Land Office had given him. The property was small, but well located, with a river providing water and nearby woods providing firewood and perhaps game. Jacob wasn't a hunter, but his grandfather's shotgun in the back reminded him that he could learn. He could learn anything he wanted. This was his land, his life, his chance. He folded the map and began gathering kindling for a fire. It was going to be a cold night, and he didn't want to freeze in his truck. By evening, he had built a fire, the flames dancing in the gathering dusk, casting shadows across the grass. Jacob sat by the fire, roasting a piece of jerky he had bought at the gas station. He took a photograph out of a drawer, the one of him and Emma and Sarah standing by the river laughing. He looked at it for a long moment, his fingers stroking the edges of the picture, as if trying to feel the warmth of those days. He did not cry, tears were not in his nature, but the ache in his chest was so sharp he could almost feel it. He had not left because he had fallen out of love with them. He had left because he loved them too much to live with suspicion, with Ethan's shadow, with questions he did not want to know the answers to. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered, his voice lost in the crackling fire. "I'm sorry, Emma." He put the photograph away and pulled out the notebook he always carried with him. It wasn't his old ledger book, filled with records of crops and debts. It was new, blank, bought in Sheridan before he'd set out for the property. He began to write without thinking, letting the words flow like a river behind him. He wrote about how he felt, why he'd left, what he'd hoped to find here. It wasn't a letter to Emma or Sarah, he knew he'd never send it. It was a letter to himself, an attempt to make sense of the chaos he'd left behind. "I didn't want to leave you," he wrote, his handwriting uneven in the firelight. "But I couldn't stay. I saw the way you looked at him, Emma, and it killed me. I don't know what's between you, and maybe I never will. But I couldn't live without knowing. I couldn't live suspecting. It's not your fault or Sarah's. It's mine. I've held on too long to the farm, to the land, to a life that may not have been ours. Now I'm here, and I don't know what comes next. But I knew I had to go. It was fair. For me. Maybe one day for you too." He closed the notebook, feeling his chest lighten a little. The fire crackled, and Jacob threw more sticks on it, watching the sparks fly up to the stars. The sky was clear, dotted with thousands of lights that seemed like beacons to him in this new, unknown world. He lay back, his hands behind his head, and looked at the stars, letting their light fill his thoughts. For the first time in a long time, he felt unburdened. There were no debts, no crops to be harvested, no Ethan's shadow haunting him. There was only him, the earth, and the sky. The next day he began work. He chose a site for the cabin, a small clearing by the river where the ground was level and the trees provided shelter from the wind. He was no carpenter, but years of farming had taught him how to handle wood. He cut down several young pine trees, using an axe from his box, and began to trim them into rough beams. The work was hard, and sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the dust, but it brought him peace. Each blow of the axe, each piece of bark he cut, was a step toward a new beginning. He was in no hurry. He had time for the first time in his life. He was not tied to seasons, to schedules, to expectations. By midday, he took a break, sitting by the river with a piece of bread and a bottle of water. He watched the water flow as calmly as his thoughts. He thought about what he would do here. Maybe he would grow something simple: potatoes, carrots, something that didn't require much effort. Maybe he would find work in Sheridan in a repair shop or on a ranch. He didn't know, but the uncertainty didn't frighten him. It was like an open road that led to who knew where, but promised adventure. By evening, he was back at work, but his thoughts were increasingly on Emma and Sarah. He imagined them waking up to an empty house, Emma finding the ring, Sarah asking where he was. He knew his departure had been a blow to them, but he hoped they would find the strength to move on. Emma was strong, stronger than he was, though he had never told her that. And Sarah was their light, their hope, and Jacob knew she would grow into a woman who could weather any storm. He ended the day as the sun sank behind the mountains, leaving the sky in shades of crimson and purple. He lit a fire and pulled out his grandfather's rifle, setting it down next to him. He hadn't planned on hunting, but its presence was comforting. It was a reminder that he could still protect himself, even if there was no one else to protect. He lay down by the fire, looking up at the stars, and for the first time in a long time, he slept without dreams, without pain, with the feeling that he had done the right thing. His new life began here, in this wild land where there was no past, only a present and a future he could build with his own hands. The punishment he chose was harsh, but it was his. And in that harshness, he found a peace he had not known on the farm. He was alone, but he was free, and that, for now, was enough. Winter came to Wyoming as quietly as the breath of a sleeping world. Snow covered the plains along the Tongue River in a thin blanket, muffling sounds and turning the landscape into a painting of white and gray. Jacob stood outside the cabin he had built in recent months, his breath steaming in the frosty air. It was a modest cabin, 4 walls of pine logs, a shingled roof, and a small window through which he looked out at the snow-capped mountains. It was not like the Wilsons' house, with its cozy porch and the smell of freshly baked bread, but it was his. Here, at the edge of the world, he had found the peace he sought, though it was a peace laced with a loneliness as sharp as a blade. Jacob spent the fall and early winter working. He cleared a small plot of land, planted potatoes and carrots that would, with luck, produce a crop in the spring. He learned to fish in the river, though his first attempts were more comical than successful. He even went hunting with his grandfather's rifle, but returned empty-handed, deciding that meat was easier to buy in Sheridan than to hunt. His life was simple, almost ascetic, but in that simplicity he found meaning. Each day spent on this wild land was a step toward becoming someone new, someone who did not carry the burden of old wounds. But the past wouldn't let him go completely. At night, when the wind howled outside the cabin and the fire crackled in the hearth, Jacob thought about Emma and Sarah. He imagined them in the empty house, Emma reading the papers he'd left behind, Sarah crying, wondering why her father was gone. These thoughts were like stones in his heart, heavy and unmoving, but he didn't let them stop him. He had left not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. He couldn't live with Ethan's shadow, with the doubt that ate away at him like rust. But now, months later, he began to wonder, what if he'd been wrong? What if the truth wasn't as he saw it? That morning, as the snow fell softly like feathers, Jacob decided to write a letter. He didn't know if he would send it, but he felt he had to put everything he had in his soul down on paper. He sat down at the rough-hewn table he had made from scrap wood and pulled out his notebook, the same one he had written in on his first night on this earth. His fingers, calloused from work, clutched a pencil, and he saw Emma's face before his eyes, her warm brown eyes, her smile that had once been just for him. Dear Emma, I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe this letter will stay here in my cabin among the mountains and the snow, where I'm trying to find myself again. But I write because I have to. Because the silence I left in our house was too loud, too heavy, and I can't carry it inside me anymore. I didn't leave because I fell out of love with you or Sarah. You were my world, my sun, my earth. But I saw the way you looked at Ethan, heard your laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. I don't know what happened between you, and I may never know. But it broke me, Emma. I couldn't live with suspicion, Couldn't look into your eyes for fear of seeing a truth there I wasn't ready to accept. I didn't scream or make a scene because I knew words would only make the pain worse. Instead, I walked away, leaving the farm, the debt, everything that bound us together. I thought it would be best for you. I thought I would set you free as I had set myself free. I was wrong, Emma. Not for leaving I couldn't stay, but for not telling you the truth, for not giving you a chance to explain. I don't know if Ethan was your betrayal or just a shadow I created in my head, but I do know that I loved you, I love you, and I always will. And Sarah, she is my light, my laughter, my hope. I see her in every ray of sunshine, in every ear of corn I ever planted. I hope she doesn't hate me for what I did. I live now on the land my father left me. It's a wild place, Emma, but it's honest. There are no lies, no debts, no shadows. Just me, the river, and the mountains. I've built a cabin, planted potatoes, and learned to live again. It's not the life I planned, but it is mine, and there's a peace in it I didn't know on the farm. I don't ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. But I want you to know, I didn't run away from you. I ran away from myself, from the pain, from the doubt. If you ever want to find me, I'm in Wyoming, by the Tongue River, not far from Sheridan. If not, I understand. Live, Emma. Live for yourself, for Sarah, for everything we once dreamed of building together. Yours always, Jacob. He reread the letter, his fingers shaking as he folded it into quarters. He didn't know if he would send it, but writing it felt like an exhalation after a long period of holding. He placed the letter in the tin box where he kept his money and the photograph, and closed the lid, as if locking away his thoughts. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the ground like a blanket, and Jacob felt that the snow, like his letter, was covering the past without erasing it. Meanwhile, back in Nebraska, Emma and Sarah were taking a new turn, painful but inevitable. The empty house Jacob had left behind was a symbol of loss, but also a beginning. Emma, after the initial shock of the papers and the ring, found the strength to act. She refused to let herself drown in grief. Sarah needed her, and that was more important than any pain. They moved to a small town 20 miles away from the farm, renting a modest apartment above a bakery. Emma took a job at the local school, teaching home economics and working in the evenings as a seamstress mending clothes for the neighbors. Her hands, accustomed to the garden and the kitchen, now handled the needle with deftness, and each stitch was her way of sewing together not only fabric but her life. Sarah, despite the tears and questions she asked every night, began to find solace in school. Her literature teacher, Mr. Clancy, noticed her talent for words and asked her to edit the school newspaper. It became an outlet for Sarah, a place where she could pour out her thoughts, her dreams, her pain. Emma never knew the full truth about the debts Jacob left behind. The bank had foreclosed on the farm, but she had arranged to pay off the rest using the money she earned. She didn't blame Jacob, though sometimes, in her darkest moments, her anger flared like dry grass. She didn't understand why he'd left, why he hadn't spoken to her, why he'd left her with a ring and silence. But she remembered his eyes, his silent pain, and somewhere deep inside she knew he'd left not out of hate, but out of love, out of fear, out of something she couldn't quite understand. Ethan had visited them a couple of times since Jacob had left. He had offered to help, talked about taking back the farm, but Emma had been cold. She had seen how his presence had hurt Sarah, how it had reminded her of her father, and she had asked him not to come again. Ethan was gone, and the shadow that had hung over their family for so long had begun to fade. Emma didn't know what Jacob had seen in their conversations, but she knew she had never betrayed him. Her laughter with Ethan had been just laughter, her looks had been just looks. But she couldn't explain that to Jacob, and now she might never be able to. A year passed. Jacob stood by the river, looking at the first potato crop he had harvested. The land was poor, but he had learned to work it, as he had learned to work himself. He never sent the letter, but it sat in a tin box, a reminder that he was still connected to the past. He began going to Sheridan more often, helping out at a local repair shop where his skill at fixing machinery was valued. He made acquaintances, but no friends. He was not ready for intimacy, for trust. His life had been lonely but honest, and that was enough for him. Emma and Sarah, meanwhile, had found their rhythm. Sarah was writing for the school newspaper, her words growing bolder, more vivid. She dreamed of college, of becoming a journalist, of seeing the world she read about in books. Emma supported her, though every time Sarah spoke of the future, she felt a twinge of pain, remembering Jacob, who would be part of that future. One spring day, as the snow in Wyoming began to melt, Jacob walked into Sheridan to buy some seeds. At the post office, he paused at the counter, looking at the envelope in his hands. It was the letter he had written to Emma. He didn't know why he had chosen to mail it that day, but something about it, maybe the meltwater running through the streets, or the smell of spring, knew it was time. He wrote down the address of their old house, knowing it would likely be forwarded, and dropped it in the mailbox, his heart clenching. The letter reached Emma 2 weeks later. She found it in the mailbox of her apartment, and her hand shook when she recognized Jacob's handwriting. She opened it, sitting in the kitchen where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and read, her eyes filling with tears. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if she wanted to find him. But the letter was like a bridge, thin and fragile, between their past and their present. Emma showed the letter to Sarah, and they sat together for a long time, talking about Jacob, about who he had been to them, about who he had become. Sarah wanted to write to him, wanted to go to Wyoming, but Emma stopped her. "Give him time," she said. "He will find us when he is ready." Their lives went on. Emma smiled more often, her sewing machine hummed in the evenings, and Sarah wrote her articles, dreaming of the big world. They had not forgotten Jacob, but they had learned to live without him, just as they had learned to live without the farm. Their pain had become a part of them, but it did not define them. And Jacob stood by the Tong River, looking out at a new horizon. He did not know if he would ever see Emma and Sarah again, but he knew that his letter was the last piece of paper he had ever sent into their world. And now he could live, knowing that he had spoken the truth, even if it was harsh. His life had been lonely, but full, like the land he now called home. And in that loneliness he had found not only punishment, but forgiveness for himself, for Emma, for all that had been and could be.